Continuing Romulus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. And the Roman and Greek months have now little or no agreement. They say, however, the day on which Romulus began to build was quite certainly the 30th of the month, at which time there was an eclipse of the sun, which they conceived to be that seen by Antimachus, the Teian poet, in the 3rd year of the 6th Olympiad, in the times of Maro the philosopher, a man deeply read in Roman history, lived, one Tarutius, his familiar acquaintance, a good philosopher and mathematician, and one too that out of curiosity has studied the way of drawing schemes and tables, and was thought to be a proficient in the art. To him Varro propounded a cast Romulus's nativity, even to the first day and hour, making his dedications from the several events of the man's life which he should be informed of, exactly as in working back a geometrical problem, for it belonged, he said, to the same science, both to foretell a man's life by knowing the time of his birth, and also to find out his birth by the knowledge of his life. This task Tarutius undertook, and first looking into the actions and causalities of the man, together with the time of his life and manner of his death, and then comparing all these remarks together, he very confidently and positively pronounced that Romulus was conceived in his mother's womb, the 1st year of the 2nd Olympiad, the 23rd day of the month the Egyptians call Koa'eak, and the 3rd hour after sunset, at which time there was a total eclipse of the sun, that he was born the 21st day of the month Thoth, about sunrising, and that the first stone of Rome was laid by him the 9th day of the month Pharmuthi, between the 2nd and 3rd hour. For the fortunes of the cities as well as of men, they think, have their certain periods of time prefixed, which may be collected and foreknown from the positions of the stars at their first foundation. But these and the like relations may perhaps not so much take and delight the reader with their novelty and curiosity as offend him by their extravagance. The city now being built, Romulus enlisted all that were of age to bear arms into the military companies, each company consisting of 3,000 footmen and 300 horse. These companies were called legions because they were the choicest and most select of the people for fighting men. The rest of the multitude he called the people, and 100 of this most eminent he chose for counselors. These he styled patricians, and their assemblies the Senate, which signifies a council of elders. The patricians, some say, were so called because they were the fathers of lawful children, others because they would give a good account, who of their own fathers were, which not every one of the rabble that poured into the city at first could do. Others from patronage, their word for protection of inferiors, the origin of which they attribute to Patron, one of those that came over with Evander, who was a great protector and defender of the weak and needy. But perhaps the most probable judgment might be that Romulus, esteeming it the duty of the chiefest and wealthiest men, with a fatherly care and concern to look after the meaner, and also encouraging the community, the commonality, not to dread or be aggrieved at the honors of their superiors, but to love and respect them, and to think and call them their fathers, might from hence give them the name of patricians. For at this very time all foreigners gave senators the style of lords, but the Romans, making use of a more honorable and less invidious name, call them patres conscripta, at first indeed simply patris, but afterwards being added patris conscripta. By this more imposing title he distinguished the Senate from the populace, and in other ways separated the nobles and the commons, calling them patrons, and these their clients, by which means he created wonderful love and amity betwixt them, productive of great justice in their dealings, for they were always in their clients' counselors in law cases, their advocates in courts of justice, in fine, their advisers and supporters in all affairs whatever. These again faithfully served their patrons, not only paying them all respect and deference, but also, in case of poverty, helping them to portion their daughters and pay of their debts, and for a patron to witness against his client, or a client against his patron, which what no law nor magistrate could enforce, and after times all other duties subsisting still between them, it was thought mean and dishonorable for the better sort to take money from their inferiors, and so much of these matters. So they were definitely right wing. People like, you have to take money from, no. As long as everybody's doing people's rights, and it gives opportunity for people to help out the poor in both their debts and their relationships, and because I'm not really talking about politics, about some political party or here when I say right wing, left wing here. In the 4th month after the city was built, as Fabius writes, the adventure of stealing the women was attempted, and some say Romulus himself, being naturally a martial man, and predisposed to, perhaps by certain oracles, to believe the fates had ordained the future growth and greatness of Rome should depend on the benefit of war, upon these accounts, first offered violence to the Sabines, since he took away only 30 virgins, more to give an occasion of war than out of any want of women. But this is not very probable. It would seem rather that, observing his city to be filled by a confluence of foreigners, a few of whom had wives, and that the multitude in general, consisting of a mixture of mean and obscure men, fell under contempt, and seemed to be of no continuance together, and hoping farther, after the women were appeased, to make this injury in some measure an occasion of confederacy and mutual commerce with the Sabines, he took in hand this exploit after this manner. First he gave it out, as if he had found an altar of a certain entity hid under the ground. The entity they call consus, either the entity of council, for they still call a consultation concilium, and their chief magistrates consuls, namely counselors, or else the equestrian Neptune, for the altar is kept covered in the Carcus Maximus at all other times, and only at horse races is exposed to public view. Others merely say that this entity had his altar hid underground, because council ought to be secret and concealed. Upon discovery of this altar, Romulus, by proclamation, appointed a day for a splendid sacrifice, and for public games and shows, to entertain all sorts of people. Many flocked thither, and he himself sat in front, amidst his nobles, clad in purple, Now the signal for their falling on was to be whenever he rose and gathered up his robe and threw it over his body, his men stood already armed, with their eyes intent upon him, and when the sign was given, drawing their swords and falling on, with a great shout, they ravished away the daughters of the Sabines, they themselves flying without any let or hindrance. They say there were but 30 taken, and from them the Curiae, our fraternities, were named. But Valerius Antius says 527, Juba 683 virgins, which was indeed the greatest excuse Romulus could allege, namely that they had taken no married women, save only Hersilia by name, and her too unknowingly, which showed they did not commit this rape wantonly, but with the design of purely forming alliance with their neighbors by the greatest and surest bonds. Well, I agree it would have been worse if they intended to take married women, but that's still unconscionable. That's what you say. This Harsilia, some say Hostilius, married a most eminent man among the Romans. Others say Romulus himself, and that she bore 2 children to him, a daughter by reason of primogeniture called Prima, and one only son, whom from the greatest concourse of citizens to him at that time he called Alius, but after ages Abelius. But Zenodotus the Troezenian, in giving this account, is contradicted by many. Among those who committed this rape upon the virgins, there were, they say, as it is so then happened, some of the meaner sort of men who were observing of a damsel. That doesn't look like a B. V-I-N-G. Carrying off a damsel, excelling all in beauty and comeliness and stature, whom, when some of superior rank that met them attempted to take away, they cried out they were carrying her to Thalassius, a young man indeed, but brave and worthy. Hearing that, they commended and applauded them loudly, and also some, turning back, accompanied them with good will and pleasure, shouting out the name of Thalassus. Hence, the Romans to this very time at their weddings sing Thalassius for their nuptial word, as the Greeks do Hymenaeus. Okay, because they say Thalassius was very happy in his marriage. Now, okay. As much as the Bible doesn't exactly require consent, it still does a little bit better than that culture. And there isn't a country in Asia or Africa that legally allows bride kidnapping. So whoever has that in their head, no, it's illegal, and even the death penalty, they'll even execute. The Muslim majority countries in particular will execute for that one. So don't think, that us moderns have, or us secular states have a safer position or something. A lot of America's the kidnapping capital of the world, I think. But Sextius Scylla, the Carthaginian, a man wanting neither learning nor ingenuity, told me Romulus gave this word as a sign when to begin the onset. Everybody therefore who made prize of a maiden, cried out Talasius, and for that reason the custom continues. So now at marriages. But most are of opinion, of whom Juba particularly is one, that this word was used to new married women by way of incitement to good housewifery, and talasia, spinning, as we say in Greek words at that time not being as yet overpowered by Italian. But if this be the case, and if the Romans did at that time use the word talasia, as we do, a man might fancy a more probable reason for the custom. For when the Sabines, after the war against the Romans, were reconciled, conditions were made concerning their women, that they should be obliged to do no other servile offices to their husbands, but what concerned spinning. It was customary, therefore, ever after at weddings, for those that gave the bride, or escorted her, or otherwise were present, sportingly to say Talasius, intimating that she was henceforth to serve in spinning and no more. It continues also a custom at this very day for the bride, not of herself to pass her husband's threshold, but to be lifted over in memory that the Sabine virgins were carried in by violence, and did not go in of their own will. Some say, too, the custom of parting the bride's hair with the head of a spear was in token of their marriages, began at first by war and acts of hostility, of which I have spoken more fully in my book of questions. Now see, we don't have to turn to the feminist to say this carrying the bride over the threshold, came from something nefarious. This rape was committed on the 18th day of the month Sextilis, now called August, on which the solemnities of Consualia are kept. The Sabines, I'm not finding the right position for this chair, I'm sorry, were a numerous and martial people, but lived in small, unfortified villages, as it befitted. They thought a colony of Lacedaemonians to be bold and fearless. Nevertheless, seeing themselves bound by such hostages to their good behavior and being solicitous for their daughters, they sent ambassadors to Romulus with fair and equitable request that he would return their young women and recall that act of violence, and afterwards, by persuasion and lawful means, seek friendly correspondence between both nations. Romulus would not part with the young women, yet proposed to the Sabines to enter into alliance with them, upon which point some consulted and demurred long. But Acron, king of the Canaanenses, a man of high spirit and a good warrior, who had all along a jealousy of Romulus's bold attempts, and considering particularly from this exploit upon the women that he was growing formidable to all people, and indeed insufferable, were he not chastised, first rose up in arms, and with a powerful army advanced against him. Romulus likewise prepared to receive him, but when they came within sight and viewed each other, they made a challenge to fight a single duel, the armies standing by under arms without participation. And among the Semites, this sort of thing happened too. It wasn't just some David and Goliath, the Bible has 3 of them, by the way, story. But, the tradition goes way back. You have a couple people, or maybe more than a couple people come out. It's like, oh yeah, have your best 10 men come out, but typically it was like, have your real, warrior come out, and then we'll make our further decision after we see them fight, right? They usually agree. It seems that sometimes they would agree to something, but armies keeping agreements when they're up in arms, when they think they can, let's give the full-on battle a chance, right? And Romulus, making a vow to Jupiter, if he should conquer, to carry himself, and dedicate his adversary's armor to his honor, overcame him in combat, and, a battle ensuing, routed his army also, and then took his city, but did those he found in it no injury, only commanded them to demolish the place and attend him to Rome, there to be admitted to all the privileges of citizens. And indeed there was nothing did more advance the greatness of Rome than that she did always unite and incorporate those whom she conquered into herself, Romulus, that he might perform his vow in the most acceptable manner to Jupiter, and withal make the pomp of it delightful to the eye of the city, cut down a tall oak which he saw growing in the camp, which he trimmed to the shape of a trophy, and fastened on it Acron's whole suit of armor, disposed in proper form, and he himself girding his clothes about him, and crowning his head with a laurel garland, his hair gracefully flowing, carried the trophy resting erect upon his right shoulder, and so marched on, slugging songs of triumph, and his whole army following after, the citizens all receiving him with acclamations of joy and wonder. The procession of this day was the origin and model of all after triumphs. This trophy was styled an offering to Jupiter Feretrius from ferire, which in Latin is to smite. Not quite the right gesture, but for Romulus prayed he might smite and overthrow his enemy, and the spoils were called opima. Our royal spoils, says Varro, from the richness which the word opus signifies, though one would more probably conjecture from opus an act, for it is only to the general of an army who with his own hand kills his enemies, general, that this honor is granted of offering the opima spalia, and 3 only of the Roman captains have had it conferred on them. First Romulus upon killing Acron the Canincian, next Cornelius Cassus for slaying Tolumnius the Tuscan, and lastly Claudius Marcellus upon his conquering Viridomarus, king of the Gauls. The 2 later, Cassus and Marcellus, made their entries in triumphant chariots, bearing their trophies themselves, but that Romulus made use of a chariot, Dionysius is wrong in asserting. Dionysius? Yes. History says Tarquinius, Demaratus' son, was the first that brought triumphs to. There's a great pomp and grandeur. Others that Publicola was the first that rode in triumph. The statues of Romulus in triumph are, as may be seen in Rome, all on foot. After the overthrow of the Canincians, the other Sabines still protracting the time in preparations, the people of Fidena, Crestomerium, and Antemna joined their forces against the Romans. They in like manner were defeated in battle, and surrendered up to Romulus their cities to be seized, their lands and territories to be divided, and themselves to be transplanted to Rome. All the lands which Romulus acquired he distributed among the citizens, except only what the parents of the stolen virgins had. These he had suffered to possess their own. The rest of the Sabines, enraged hereat, choosing Tatius their captain, marched straight against Rome. The city was almost inaccessible, having for its fortress that which is now the Capitol, where a strong guard was placed, and Tarpeius, their captain. Not Tarpeia, the virgin, as some say, who would make Romulus a fool, but Tarpeia, daughter to the captain, and coveting the golden bracelets she saw them wear, betrayed the fort to the Sabines' hands, and axed, in reward of her treachery, the things they wore on their left arms. Tatius conditioning thus with her, in the night she opened one of the gates, and received the Sabines, and truly Antigonus, it would seem, was not solitary in saying he loved betrayers, but hated those who had betrayed, nor Caesar, who told Remitalcus, the Thracian, that he loved the treason, but hated the traitor. But it is the general feeling of all who have occasion for wicked men's service, as people have for the poison of venomous beasts. They are glad of them while they are of use, and abhor their baseness when it is over. And so then did Tatius behave towards Tarpeia, for he commanded the Sabines in regard to their contract not to refuse her the least part of what they wore on their left arms, and he himself first took his bracelet off his arm, and threw that, together with his buckler, at her, and all the rest following, she being borne down, and quite buried with the multitude of gold, and their shields died under the weight and pressure of them. Tarpeius also himself, being prosecuted by Romulus, was found guilty of treason, as Juba says of Sulpicius Galba relates. Now, was it episode of South Park? The guy tried to carry in all this fake treasure, but real or not, yeah, there's been people that have seriously hurt themselves in their greed. Not even waiting for revenge for what they, did, right? Those who write otherwise concerning Tarpeia, as that she was the daughter of Tatius, the Sabine captain, and being forcibly detained by Romulus, acted and suffered thus by her father's contrivance, speak very absurdly, of whom Antigonus is one, and Simalus, the poet, who thinks Tarpeia betrayed the Capitol, not to the Sabines, but to the Gauls, having fallen in love with their king, talks mere folly, saying thus: Tarpeia 'twas, who, dwelling close thereby, laid open Rome unto the enemy. She, for the love of the besieging Gaul, betrayed the city's strength, the Capitol. And a little sister, speaking of her death, the numerous nations of the Celtic foe bore her, not living, to the banks of Po. Their heavy shields upon the maid they threw, and with their splendid gifts entombed at once and slew. Tarpeia afterwards was buried there, and the hill from her was called Tarpeius until the reign of King Tarquin, who dedicated the place to Jupiter, at which time her bones were removed, and so it lost her name, except only that part of the Capitol which they still call the Tarpeian rock, from which they used to cast down malefactors. The Sabines, being possessed of the hill, Romulus, in great fury, bade them battle, and Tatius was confident to accept it, perceiving, if they were overpowered, that they had behind them a secure retreat, the level in the middle, where they were to join battle, being surrounded with many little hills, seemed to enforce both parties to a sharp and desperate conflict, by reason of the difficulties of the place, which had but a few outlets, inconvenient either for refuge or pursuit. Now, you don't have to look to the interview of the Hitler Youth billionaire or whatever to see the level of greed that betraying a whole city, letting people, a whole city of people getting killed, or if they're losing what they have and all this other stuff. Just for, well, someone else would have done it, and I got but it's the way for me to make my money. I've not only one woman, when me relating the fact that something that I saw in a documentary about that said for every $2,000 of diamond, you ended up with, on average, one dead African asking stuff like, "Where's this African?" Seriously, more than multiple people told me, responded like that. I'm like, joke or not, that's no. It happened too, the river having overflowed not many days before, there was left behind in the plain where now the Forum stands a deep blind mud and slime, which, though it did not appear much to the eye and was not easily avoided at bottom, was deceitful and dangerous, upon which the Sabines, being unwarily about to enter, met with the peace of good fortune. For Curtius, a gallant man, eager of honour and of aspiring thoughts, being mounted on horseback, was galloping on before the rest, and mired his horse here, and endeavouring for a while by whip and spur and voice to disentangle him, but finding it impossible, quitted him and saved himself. The place from him to this very time is called the Curtain Lake. The Sabines, having avoided this danger, began to fight very smartly, the fortune of the day being very dubious, though many were slain, amongst whom was Hostilius, who they say was husband to Hersilia, and grandfather to that Hostilius who reigned after Numa. There were many other brief conflicts, we may suppose, but the most memorable was that last, in which Romulus, having received a wound on his head by a stone, and being almost felled to the ground by it and disabled, the Romans gave way, and being driven out of the level ground, fled towards the Palatium. Romulus, by this time recovering from his wound a little, turned about to renew the battle, and facing the flyers with a loud voice, encouraged them to stand and fight. But being overborne with numbers, and nobody daring to face about, stretching out his hands to heaven, he prayed to Jupiter to stop the army, and not to neglect, but maintain the Roman cause. Now in extreme danger, the prayer was no sooner made